Folks, I love Ewoks, as everyone knows. In fact, I just completed my set of Ewok banks from the 80s. Super excited over that. Anyway, so today I want to talk about the Ewok movies, and in this video I'm going to talk about the first one, which was called An Ewok Adventure. Now, it's most commonly known as Caravan of Courage now, but I grew up calling it Ewok Adventure because that's what it was called back in my day. Now, I know over in Europe it actually did get a theatrical release as Caravan of Courage, and I can only imagine how awesome that was if you were to go into the theater and see that movie. I saw it on TV back when it came out in November of 1984, and I loved it. I remember we saw the ad for it. We begged our dad, "You got to record it." And so on his Betamax, that's right, Betamax, he recorded it, and we watched it the next day. Now, the story surrounds the Tatwani family, Chase, Sindel, and their mom and dad, and it opens up with their mom and dad looking and calling out for their kids. See, they crash landed on Endor, and then suddenly, from the dark mist of Endor woods, comes a giant beast. It was the Gorax. Oh my goodness, folks, when I first saw that, I was scared to death as a kid. I remember just watching it going, you know, it always got me. It always terrified me. The Gorax, this menacing, hulking character, you were so scared of him the whole time he was on there. What a great villain, right? Big villain, and he's hardly even in it. I know it does show his dog, and it's kind of dated with some of the claymation they did, but back in the day, those special effects, man, I know it was made on the cheap, but for me, it looked fantastic, and it was obviously part of the Star Wars universe. I mean, like, in my mind, it was already up there with the rest of the movies. When we talked about, you know, the trilogy from Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi, I always said, okay, don't forget about those two Ewok movies now, because those were part of the overall story, and I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. Now, it focuses on the parents getting captured and the kids getting help from the Ewoks to go, you know, brave the dangers of Endor to get to the Gorax's castle to free their parents and escape the Gorax. What a great story. It kind of has a Lord of the Ring feel, because as they're building this caravan, they're going to the Gorax's castle, they're building this caravan of different Ewoks, and they're adding basically 2 more Ewoks to their group. They're encountering them. Tank, the Mystic, and Chuknakrok, and he's the woodsman, the warrior. Both of those characters are fantastic. Now, they don't talk about the Force. They talk about Ewok magic, which basically is the Force, right? Ewoks, and we find out in the EU, the Force is called different things depending on where you go. And for the Ewoks, it was just magic. So obviously, Tank, people like Logray are, you know, Force sensitive, and they can do some amazing things. And maybe Tank has a little crystal. Maybe that's a caliber crystal. We're never really told all that. At least I don't think so. There was some stuff mentioned from these movies and some, I think it was, Wizard of the Coast. RPGs. I think they did mention a little bit of it. And of course, Kevin J. Anderson mentions it in his Star Wars Illustrated Universe. He goes into a little bit more detail, but I'll talk about that later. The characters in this, the children, the main stars, were relatable. We really didn't like Mace that much, the kid. We thought he was kind of whiny and annoying, but that was his character, I think. And by the way, I need to mention that some of the autobiographies of people who were in this, like Warwick Davis, who was Wicked, he hardly even mentions these movies. When I got his book, his autobiography about all his life and times and experiences, starting with Jedi and going all the way to the Leprechaun series and beyond, I was like, all right, finally, we're going to get to hear some behind-the-scenes stories from the Ewok movies, because you don't hear any of that. A long time ago, both these movies came out in DVD. It was a double feature, and it had no extra features on it. It had no behind the scenes, had no commentary from the cast or crew. And I was like, what? I want to know more about it. And so when I got Warwick Davis's autobiography, I was like super excited. He just mentions the movies and moves on. After, you know, several chapters of his early life being in Jedi, he says, oh yeah, and then we made these 2 movies, and then I did this. And you're like, wait, You don't mention hardly anything about the TV movies. I thought that was garbage. I hated that. But thankfully, Eric Walker, who played the kid, Mace, he actually wrote a autobiography, and he really wrote it. He should have had an editor. The book is not that good, but the details in there, his experiences on the movie, was really insightful, especially this movie, because he had not much to do with the other movie. But for this movie, he talks a lot about what went on. We all know that George was very heavily involved with this movie. In fact, Mace tells us that, or Eric Walker, I should say, tells us that in his autobiography. Lucas did a lot of the reshoots for the movie. He edited some of the movie, and he helped write the story for the movie. That's more than he ever did for the Clone Wars. Yet Lucasfilm's excuse to make the Clone Wars canon was like, well, George really had a lot of involvement in there, and he sanctioned that. So, he sanctioned everything in Star Wars. Anything about Star Wars had to get George's approval. And I remember there was an interview where George had 3 little stamps about where he'd stamp his approval or needs work or could be better, I think. CBB, could be better. And he would send stamps about what, production examples, costumes, creatures, ideas, and stuff. So George was constantly involved in this movie. I mean, heck, he even directed some of the reshoots, and it was all done on Skywalker Ranch, too, or around there. Most of it. Sometimes they did go back to the Redwood Forest in California to get some, classic shots of Endor, but most of it was filmed in his backyard. So he was there all the time. He was heavily involved. Now, this came out as a television movie, I told you, November 1984 on ABC. For some reason, it was only their second most watched TV movie that year. What was the first? I don't know. I should have Googled, best most watched TV movie in 1984 by ABC. Dang, that was a good idea. I should have done that. Anyway, Eric Walker in his autobiography talks about, the joys of working with George, a lot of the, creative ideas he had for set pieces, for scenes, for shots and stuff, and how he had an overall very positive experience about the whole thing. Now, they actually filmed a 50s-esque commercial for it where he and Sindel and Wicked walk into a 50s diner, order sundaes or whatever, and then they say, hey, you need to check us out on, the upcoming movie. But they nixed it because they said, that's really weird. And that is weird. Why would they do that? Why do a 50s shoot for a sci-fi movie? I don't know. But I wish stuff like that was on the DVD. Now, Eric Walker also talks about there's an error in the movie where Mace gets his hand stuck in a tree, but when we cut to the shot where they're healing his wounded hand, it's the opposite hand. And that always bugged us as kids. It's like, wait a minute, what happened? That's the wrong hand. I thought maybe they switched the frames in it, or did they just forget that which hand got stuck in the tree? No, that's because he said they actually filmed a different scene where he was messing with this space flower. And that was the correct hand that had gotten damaged during that scene when he stuck his hand in the flower. But then they decided to reshoot it and make it a tree for whatever reason, and George reshot that. So, here's George Lucas's involvement in something that came out in television, should have been T-canon, but is actually C-canon, or was C-canon, and then got brushed away to Legends because I guess George didn't direct all of it, maybe. Now, I'm just kidding, because I know the real reason they kept Clone Wars just because they wanted to. And they should have just said that. It's kind of ridiculous to say, well, George had a lot of involvement in Clone Wars. No, he didn't. You can look at all the behind-the-scenes DVDs on the DVDs that came out. All the extra features talk about how George maybe had an idea here and there for a script idea, but that was about as far as he went. Whereas we hear in an Ewok Adventure, he's here approving things, writing stories, directing, and editing. Not all of it, but some of it. That seems that you're way more involved in that one. But anyway, I digress. The point is, the movie is pretty darn good, in my opinion. Now, if you were to watch it today, you'd think, this is a little kiddie mat, and you'd probably be right. But for me, who loves Ewoks, absolutely love this movie. Love this movie. Now, 2 things I want to mention about this movie and how it connects to the expanded universe. Sindel Tatwani is actually a character who will get mentioned in the Black Fleet Crisis. I think it's Tyrant's Test. And she's only mentioned there, like, kind of throwaway mention, but someone like me, when I was reading it, I stood out of my chair. I was like, what? Shut up! And I was so excited to see her name. Now, Matthew P. Q. McDowell probably just threw it in there for fun. Either way, though, I was really happy to see a movie that I grew up loving, adoring as a kid, get mentioned in the expanded universe. On top of that, Kevin J. Anderson even mentioned a Gorax being in Return of the Jedi. I think it was in Kip Durham was traveling back to Endor to kind of find Darth Vader's ashes to, you know, relive the good old Sith days. He flies over a Gorax walking, you know, meandering through the forest. And I was like, oh, shut up. Does that mean that these movies take place at the same time as Jedi Academy? No, sadly they take place before Return of the Jedi, and I'll explain why this makes sense later on. But anyway, should you watch an Ewok Adventure? Yes, you should. I think it's a fantastic movie, and I can't wait to talk about the next movie, Battle for Endor, coming up next time.